Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. I know we don't really talk much about the sequel trilogy on this channel, and moving forward it's something I want to address and start looking at again. I generally like to let things stew around a little bit before I actually comment on them. Now obviously the execution of the new trilogy was chaotic as the fall of the Empire. We had competing directors with completely different visions of what direction Star Wars should have went in, and therefore we had a very incomplete and janky feeling trilogy, which really is 3 separate movies with very little cohesion, especially when you compare it to the prequel trilogy or even the original trilogy. But as you all know, on this channel we like to pay more attention to the side stories and characters that surround the mainstream canon in movies. These stories are oftentimes not as restrictive, and writers can open up with their creativity. This is why a lot of you guys watch this channel. You're looking for those gems of stories that are kind of hidden in all the chaotic legends and now the new canon lore. And despite all the chaos and confusion between all of the content in the sequel era, everything has been pointing in one direction, and the signs are obvious and too hard to ignore. And at the core of it all is this concept of rejecting the old and embracing the new. This is going to be controversial, especially for some of our older fans. After all, we are creatures of emotion and we really love our nostalgia. And our first exposure to something as immense as Star Wars oftentimes shapes our views and expectations for the entire franchise. When the original Star Wars came out, it was a huge deal. I imagine I wasn't there. For me, it was the prequels that won me over, seeing massive droid armies face off against the Gungans or Anakin pod racing. Sure, we chuckle at it all now, but back then when you were 10 years old, it was extremely epic. The sequels are new, and it's a new company that's running the show, a company that has massive amounts of influence and money, and is seeking to create a monopoly of ideas targeting children all over America. That should terrify us. Like in almost every industry today, we Americans are seeing an illusion of choice. Monopolies are here, and the antitrust laws that were supposed to protect us are as old and outdated as the politicians trying to lead us. At this point, we can only hope that these large corporations are behaving in the best interests of their consumers, which is a very sustainable business model. And I say that without any sarcasm because it is a terrifying notion that a cartoon mouse and not a human being is making the choices for humanity's future children. One can only hope that control of the cheese market is his ultimate goal. So what is the message behind the new trilogy? What exactly is Disney trying to say to us? Well, first there's the more clear and obvious political message that a lot of corporations are kind of cashing in on today. And one of those decisions is to create more diversity, which can be a really good thing. Good in the case of bringing skilled and charismatic actors like John Boyega. Wish they didn't toss his storyline to the side, of course, Ryan. But hey. And then there's Daisy Ridley as a female replacement for the Chosen One. We also have Adam Driver, who just has a very atypical face. Good for you, Driver, and also good for Disney for including more voices and diversity and different types of stories into their main canon. It's good for society, but do remember that corporations like Disney most likely do not care at all about social change and are only worried about the bottom line. There's a whole industry called reputation management and business consulting, and it's disingenuous as hell. It's like when Pepsi pretends to care about, I don't know what this is actually, Black Lives Matter? Do you really believe Pepsi, the same Pepsi that targets African American communities and minority communities and inundates them with diabetes and heart disease? Pepsi does not care about any social cause. So screw you, Pepsi. I do like it more than Coca-Cola, but don't pretend like you care about me or any social change. I obviously have some trust issues with corporations, and that's something I need to work on because, to be a good American means to be a good consumer. Now, what about the underlying messages beneath the political message that Disney is trying to push out towards us? It's so thinly veiled that one of the characters, Kylo Ren, actually says it.
It's time to let old things die. Snoke, Skywalker, the Sith, the Jedi, the rebels, let it all die.
And honestly, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, sorry guys, Star Wars will probably never return to its original state, and that's probably a good thing. Even if George Lucas came back, he would have probably turned it into Star Wars 7, The Adventure of Osmosis Jones and the Midichlorians. And even if we were somehow able to capture the magic of the original Star Wars films, it just wouldn't hold up today. I mean, everything has changed. Cinema and storytelling has evolved. Characters are expected to be more realistic and therefore more flawed and imperfect. Gone are the notions of pure evil and pure good. because we rarely encounter these things in real life. With the original Star Wars film, what we had was exactly that. The world was stuck in the Cold War, with the great evil Soviet Union pitted against American exceptionalism and capitalism. Luke Skywalker's pure good and the Empire and its devious Sith Emperor represented evil. The two sides were intertwined in this internal fight between the dark side and light side of the Force. But that was essentially all we knew at the time. The creator Lucas had yet to have created the prequel series, and so the Force was mysterious. No midichlorians had been created yet, and we didn't really know much about the Jedi Order and what it was like. We didn't see the Jedi Temple at the height of its power in Coruscant, and we knew nothing about this terrible war that supposedly ended all of the Jedi's lives. Now, in the absence of information, fans cosplayed, speculated, created religions, or sometimes did all three. When the prequels finally came around, Lucas, for better or worse, exposed us to what the Jedi actually were and what their counterparts, the Sith, were as well. We got a more in-depth look at the so-called Golden Age of the Republican Jedi. What we found was shocking and quite different from the expectations we had built in our minds. Instead of finding a thriving, open-minded organization fighting for the good of all humans, and maybe some aliens, we found a Jedi Order that was terrified and controlled by disciplinarians. An order that had so many rules to prevent its followers from falling to the dark side. It was an order of fear. And worst of all, we found a Jedi Order that had become puppets to the Republic and the Supreme Chancellor. Sure, there were really cool and awesome individual Jedi who met and surpassed our expectations, but the run-of-the-mill Jedi were so disappointing. They were constantly afraid of breaking the Jedi Code and also their own ethical rules. At the same time, they were emotionally stunted and unable to develop meaningful relationships with other sentient beings. The Jedi basically sucked at being people. While the Jedi were a bit underwhelming and perhaps a little angsty, the Sith were surprisingly good in a most evil way. Gone was the mysterious evil Emperor. In his place, the venerable senator from Naboo, Sheev Palpatine. Combined with additional reading material like the Darth Plagueis novel, Palpatine was slowly shaping into one of the most interesting characters in Star Wars history. It was enthralling watching the nefarious games that the Sith populace would play behind the scenes with the galactic economy and political landscape. In many ways, it mirrored our own reality and political landscape, and because of that, it connected us further to this world. Lucas surprised us once again because although the Jedi were the focus of the story, it really was the world and cultures he created in the background that stole the show. We fell in love with the clones. We watched in awe as these brave and courageous children, trapped in the bodies of soldiers, rushed across the great battlefields of the Outer Rim against the lifeless Separatist droid army. The Clone Wars cartoons then further fleshed out this period of Star Wars history and gave us information that we didn't even know we wanted. And perhaps the most rewarding and heartbreaking of all, we began seeing the Jedi crack under the strain of their restrictive order and the devastating consequences that war had on their ideology and self-image. Once an individual truly learns what the Jedi Order is about, can only come to the conclusion that putting a Jedi on the battlefield is like dropping an ice cube on a skillet. The two ways of life were not compatible. The Jedi could not preserve and protect life, and also remain detached from emotion while in the middle of a killing field. The Jedi belonged in a monastery where they could peacefully practice this kind of internal self-improvement. Too many Jedi fell not because of their lack of skill, well, maybe Coleman Trevor did, but many lost their way because their leaders did not prepare them for what they were about to see on the battlefield. You had individuals like Barriss Offee, who bombed the Jedi Temple in protest to what the Order had become, enforcers for the Republic. But it wasn't just war that made the Jedi turn away from the light. It was also the Jedi and their complete rejection of anything from the dark side. Now, obviously, thousands of years fighting against the Sith would create a hardened position for the Jedi Order. But as we all know, once upon a time, the Jedi and Sith were one within the ancient Jedi Order. These Force users respected and learned about both sides of the Force. The key was balancing the dark and light side energy that everyone had inside of themselves. If anyone leaned too heavily to one side of the Force or the other, they were usually quarantined in a Force-rich area that was usually the opposite alignment to what they were. This way they could balance themselves out. This was a better time when things were less restrictive. The masters of the Order were less afraid and open-minded. The Jedi treated each other as individuals and not as ticking time bombs. This is exactly how many Jedi would view individuals like Anakin Skywalker because he didn't follow the traditional route to Jedihood. And so the Jedi would create the Sith when they completely rejected the notion of individuals studying only the dark side of the Force. These Sith exiles went from being curious students to a militarized extremist force out of necessity. They just wanted to survive. And so for thousands of years, the Jedi and the Sith would massacre each other, sending anger and hate in every direction, limiting progress for the rest of society and causing endless amounts of pain and suffering for the galaxy. All because the Jedi and Sith were no longer whole. And so during the Clone Wars, we had heart-wrenchingly beautiful moments where true paragons of good like Ahsoka Tano were demonized and condemned for questionable crimes by the very Jedi that were supposed to protect her. We see the goodness in Anakin too, who tries to go against the Jedi Order's restrictive ways and protect the individual he loved. When Anakin finally clears Ahsoka's name and she refuses to rejoin the Jedi, there's a moment of anguish but also relief. It's at that moment when the audience realizes that if Ahsoka Tano is pure good and the Jedi were unable to see that, then what have the Jedi become? If only Anakin had left with her and maybe brought along Padme and, Obi-Wan's unborn child, maybe things would have happened differently. But then we have stories like Cal Kestis, a survivor of the Purge, an apprentice of the great Lasat warrior Gerard DePaul, who despite his strength and stature, was unable to absorb blaster bolts into his heart. Cal Kestis finds himself paired with a tortured Force user, a former Jedi Master by the name of Cira Junda, who fell to the dark side and ultimately was unable to stop her own apprentice from being an Inquisitor. Cira Junda is an evil, but that holier-than-thou attitude of the Jedi is gone from her, replaced by a palpable sense of danger that only a weapon can emit. She still fights for good. She fights for a holocron with a list of Force-sensitive children that could be the future of a new Jedi Order. I appreciate the fact that throughout Cal's entire adventure, everything is kind of confusing and muddled. We're not really sure who's good or bad. Cal even meets the last Death Mori Witch, a Force user who channels the planet's Ichor through her to create terrifying undead warriors. Her appearance and natural affinity with black magic and dark side energy does not taint who she is as a person. She is flawed, but also good. And so when Cal Kestis finally achieves knighthood, he's given the status by a failed Jedi Master holding a red lightsaber that belongs to her former Padawan. And when Cal Kestis has a choice to restart the Jedi Order and condemn a group of children to a life like his own, he refuses to do so. Our view of the Jedi continues to shift. Now, does art reflect reality, or does reality drive art? I'd like to think it's a bit more of the latter. I like the idea that we are in control of our own future, and also we are our own muses. It's a very human thing to do. So our generation has asked us this question: why hold ourselves to be the paragons of good when all we need to do is try our best and learn from the mistakes that we do end up committing? The reality is there are very few Jedi in the world and very few Sith. In this world, most people fall somewhere in between and are ultimately redeemable. This is why we want to see the characters in our films reflect that truth. This is what makes Kylo Ren such an excellent character. I mean, he might be pretty whiny and probably emo, but the reality is his tortured story is probably more relatable to today's audiences than Luke's flawless ascension into the rebellion. And so when we see Luke discard that lightsaber and everything we grew up to understand about the Jedi, I understand how that could be really painful, especially to the original fans. I understand how much it hurts to see a childhood hero turn away from the light. But imagine the alternative. What kind of person would embrace the Jedi Order knowing what it had become? An organization that collected information on Force-sensitive babies and then seized or at times even kidnapped them in order to make sure that they didn't go to the dark side. This is an organization that served as mercenaries in a not completely justified war. If you really think about it, Luke didn't need the Jedi training in order to defeat Darth Sidious and turn Darth Vader against the Sith. He did it all through the goodness of his heart, from the values he learned as a moisture farmer on Tatooine. It's really the rejection of this groupthink mentality, of this structure and organization. And if we look at Star Wars going forward, maybe that is the direction we want to head into, the embrace of individualism and the individual's worth. If we stop looking at people based on the groups or the stereotypes that they belong to, we'll have a much more accurate understanding of people. And I think that is ultimately the positive message that I think Star Wars can and hopefully will deliver to all of its fans. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.